by Gus Prestera, Dr. Gus Prestera. I've known Gus for a while. I've known Gus for quite a while now. We again kept showing up in the same places. I have had the privilege of seeing Gus present several times, and it's always wonderful. It's always enjoyable. It's always informative. I always learn a lot. Gus, you'll have to help me here. I'm not sure of your current title over there at Performance Development. It's Vice President.
I'm a partner and Executive Director of Client Services.
There you go, Executive Director of Client Services. With great admiration, and I'm really, really happy that Gus has decided to do this for us. I'm going to turn the platform over to Gus. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll try to field it and get it to Gus. All right, Gus, do you want me to pull it up, or are you going to pull up your PowerPoint there?
I will try to pull it up. See what happens.
All right.
Yeah, seems to work. Are you able to see that?
I can.
Great.
All
right. We're off to the races. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Just to elaborate on what Bobby was just saying, I am a partner over at Performance Development Group. I actually joined Performance Development Group back in July when we merged my old company, Effect Performance, with PDG. Became a partner in the firm and now head up all of Client Services, which is the part of the business that handles everything from custom training, consulting, managed services, and so forth. So I oversee the project managers, the instructional designers, the developers, graphic designers, consultants, and so forth on a day-to-day basis. So I've been doing this for a bit, I guess about 15 years or so. I have been involved in training and in e-learning in particular. So I often get asked about project. I'm often asked to train instructional designers on how to manage projects. That's a very natural evolution for a lot of instructional designers to go from designing courses to eventually managing the project for the courses that they're developing. So there's a lot of interesting things that you can pull out of the project management discipline, the project management field, that you can apply to managing instructional design projects and e-learning projects in particular. And there's also some interesting things that happen within an e-learning project that maybe are a little bit different from other types of projects that cause us to have to kind of rethink or adapt the sort of basic techniques and tools that the field of project management offers us. So I like to play in that space of trying to figure out kind of what we can learn from project management and what can project management learn from e-learning development. And so in addition to the work that I do for Performance Development Group, I'm also an adjunct faculty member over at Penn State, where I teach a couple of e-learning design courses for the e-learning design certificate program there. So anyway, so it's my vocation and my avocation and my hobby. So let me jump right into the agenda. We'll take questions. We'll be collecting questions through the chat room throughout the session. There are a few kind of stopping points throughout where we'll stop, and I'll try to address some of those questions and then move on. I have a number of samples and things like that to show, and I'll kind of, you may see me skip over some things depending on where the questions are and where your interests are. I may skip over some things to get to other things and then leap back and so forth. So try not to get too concerned about that. I'll also have the slides available as a handout later. I'll make a PDF out of them and we'll post them up on the website. So as far as an agenda, very loose, rough agenda here. We're going to first talk about what are some unique challenges for people who are managing e-learning projects, and what do project managers need to manage, in particular when it comes to e-learning, and what are some best practices and techniques and tools associated with doing those kinds of things. So let me jump right in. I can master Wimba here. So PM's mission is to deliver a project on time, on quality, and on budget. And project managers will usually tell you that on time doesn't mean early. It also doesn't mean late. It means figuring out when something needs to be delivered and making sure it gets delivered on time. It also doesn't mean on quality doesn't necessarily mean building a Mona Lisa every time, painting a Mona Lisa every time, or building the most fabulous thing possible every time. It means figuring out what it is that you really need to do in order to hit the quality goals, and then building to those goals, to those standards, those requirements, those specifications. So that's usually what's meant by on quality. And then, of course, on budget doesn't mean coming in under budget, doesn't mean coming in over budget. Again, trying to figure out what is it that you need, what are the resources that are needed, and trying to hit those budget requirements. Not too many people complain if you come in under budget, though, usually. But if you do come in significantly under budget, it does make people ask the question of, did you do enough to drive the quality to where it needed to be, or do enough to get things delivered on time? So the key there is really hitting all three of these at the same time, getting things done on time, on quality, and on budget simultaneously. And that's the juggling act that project managers in any field have to struggle with. So what makes it, a particularly unique challenge within the learning field? And a lot of it has to do with the complexity. There's a lot of different people involved, a lot of different steps in the process. This e-learning roadmap is something I downloaded off the internet, and I'd love to actually create one myself like this if I had some more graphic design skills. And so you may see that next year. I may recruit one of my graphic designers to create something like this for me. But it's a nice little map that kind of shows kind of what a typical e-learning development process looks like, where it starts off over here on the left-hand side with strategy development. If I can use one of these tools here. Yeah, there we go. A little arrow. Then you move into, as you define your strategy, you move into then content development, and you start working with subject matter experts and end users to figure out what the content needs to be. Then you create some kind of a pilot typically. Sometimes you don't, but usually you do. Then that pilot, you eventually get some feedback from folks, and you start refining, and until you get to the point where you can start building the thing, the full Monty, if you will, and that's when you bring to bear the full resources and capabilities of your project team, and then you're going to deploy that course. Typically, these days, the most common way to deploy a course, an e-learning course, is through a learning management system, which is nothing but a big fancy server with technology on it that enables us to deploy courses and then track the usage of those courses over time. So a lot of stuff going on there. But in particular, what makes an e-learning design project different from other types of projects, and especially from other types of learning projects, from other, like, for example, developing classroom training, is the involvement of technologies, a lot of technologies. So there's technologies that have to do with process management, like Microsoft Project, graphics development, like Adobe Photoshop, Flash development tools like Adobe Flash, and for each of those, there's tons of other alternatives that you can use. There's also a learning management system itself and all the requirements around that. Lots of different file formats, lots of different standards. It's a pretty big, nasty, complicated mess as far as the tools that we're using. So what happens is that typically there is no one person who knows all the different tools intimately enough to be able to build a proper e-learning course. There are some few exceptions, but for the most part, the industry has gotten to a point where we need to work collaboratively with people from different disciplines in order to develop an e-learning course, and at least something decent and good. So that's one wrinkle. The other wrinkle is the team composition itself. And here you have a diagram here that shows different team members that might be involved in a typical e-learning project. And so even when you have, for example, a representative that would form part of a core team like this one here, where there's 4 people here in the middle, you might have a graphic design lead, you might have an instructional design lead, you might have a development lead, you might have a project manager. and those might form the nucleus of that team. But typically, they're bringing in other people, other developers, other graphic designers, other instructional designers. And then there's, of course, all the stakeholders, which aren't even shown here. So now the interesting thing, I mean, there's a lot of projects that involve a lot of different people, but with e-learning, the disciplines themselves tend to draw from people from very different backgrounds. People who go into the graphic design field are pretty radically different from people who go into the instructional design field. And they're very different from the people who go into development, into programming, right? And so you have very different cultures that form around each of those disciplines. Different cultures, different personality types, and now you're bringing them together to work on a project in a collaborative form, in a collaborative way, typically under tight deadlines, and are being asked to deliver on time, on quality, and on budget. So it's as much about the composition, the mix of those disciplines, personalities, and expertise that makes it a bit messy from a team dynamic standpoint. Then, of course, there are the stakeholders. With a typical classroom-based training course, you might have the target learners, you might have their bosses, you might have subject matter experts. But because there isn't a technology component to it, oftentimes you don't have quite as many stakeholders as you have involved in a typical e-learning project. So in addition to the usual folks, e-learning oftentimes will cause e-learning projects will often cause a project team to bump into people from the marketing department who are setting standards on how the organization communicates electronically all of its materials. And so oftentimes e-learning courses need to conform to the marketing department's branding style guidelines and communication guidelines and so forth. There's legal and compliance, of course. There's the IT department, which is in and of itself its own little significant stakeholder, because oftentimes they control the learning management system on which the course is going to be deployed, as well as any other technologies, infrastructure technologies that the organization has. And so getting any kind of an e-learning project up and running is ultimately going to involve a lot of stakeholders, again, from a wide variety of people, disciplines, and really a cross-section of the organization. So, again, it makes it complicated. So let me stop here before I back up a second. No, actually, I won't back up a second. I'll stop after this one here. So what PMs manage then? There's a lot of things that a project manager manages. I've selected 3 that I think are especially important, and they're kind of in this order in my mind. They manage stakeholders, and that to me is the number one thing that a project manager does, and the most important value that they bring to a project is managing stakeholders. As we've talked about, there's lots of different stakeholders, lots of different people involved. They manage team dynamics, and they manage the communications among team members and between the team and the other stakeholders. And that's a very important function that they serve. And so I'll focus a lot of attention on techniques and best practices for managing stakeholders. The other is almost as important, managing the process. They need to manage dependencies, handoffs, risks, and a number of other process factors that enable the project to be successful. And then, of course, there's quality, managing quality, making sure that the requirements are properly gathered, and that we're managing the inputs into the project, the throughputs, that's the work that's being done, and then, of course, the outputs, making sure that anything that goes out to stakeholders and clients, internal or external, are high quality or of the right quality. And, of course, managing the testing and reviews and so forth that go along with that. All with the intent of keeping the project on time, on budget, on quality. So obviously there's other things that they do, but these 3 things to me are absolutely key. So let me stop here before we dive into these 3 areas. And let me ask you guys, what are some other things that you think differentiate e-learning projects from other types of projects that maybe raise some unique challenges?
Folks, you can type it in the chat. Gus, do you want me to open up the audio and see if we can get some people to ask audio questions here?
Sure.
All right. Want to ask the question again, Gus? See if we can. There we go.
Scope creep, yeah, definitely a problem. And because of the cross-functional nature, so many different disciplines involved, and so many different stakeholders, scope creep is an especially nasty problem because anything that changes about the project needs to be communicated to so many different people. And there's this cascading effect that any disruption in a project has on these other disciplines within the team and on all these other folks that are involved in the process. So a simple delay of a week, let's say, just in the timeline, might cause us to miss a window of opportunity to be able to test a course on a learning management system. And then we may get bumped to the back of the line, and it may take another 3 weeks to move back up to the top of the list. And then, of course, the scope creep in terms of change, processes, the scope of the project changing, where maybe suddenly we're looking at something that we thought was going to be a 1 hour long course, really starts to look more like a 2 hour long course. It's going to be a much bigger drain on resources and much bigger drain on our stakeholders too, because we're going to be asking them to do more for us, to review more for us, provide more content. So again, the project manager is so key in managing scope creep and in managing the communications around scope creep.
There's a lot going on in the chat over there, Gus. You might want to pick out some of these and comment on them.
Rolling back up here. Adding stakeholders along the way. Yes, that's also a nasty one. Attention and understanding is a challenge. And Bobby, maybe you could elaborate on that, on the intention and understanding?
I think just defining it's back to the old, there was an excellent article in Training and Development this month on why you don't ever leave out the needs analysis. I think it's back to the basics. A lot of times the project has multiple meanings to multiple people. And it's not, from the beginning, it's not clearly defined what the learners are, what the outcomes are, what the strategy is, what we're trying to do, how we're going to assess it, are we going to know if it works, where is it going to reach. So if you don't have those things defined clearly in the beginning, then scope creep happens, other people start taking ownership, the stakeholders increase. It's like, it's like a virus, it spreads.
It does, you're right. The software keeps evolving. Yeah, that's a challenge on many fronts, right? Because we use software in so many different ways. So in terms of our development software, sometimes our developers might be using different versions of the same software, even within the team. And sometimes we're producing something, let's say something in Flash that maybe we're working in CS3, or creating something in ActionScript 3 that is going to be publishing a file that requires a certain plugin of a certain version in order to be able to play. So we publish it, we're confident, we've tested it, we've done everything right, we publish it, and then we find out that from the company's technology folks that actually, the whole organization hasn't moved up to that player yet, to that plugin, and so the course won't run properly. When it's played from most of the computers by the other people in the organization. So again, that's something that the project manager has to keep an eye on, is making sure that whatever we're producing in a way that ultimately is going to run well for the end users. This is certainly an issue for classroom instruction and other types of projects, but it's such a bigger issue with e-learning because of the reliance on technology in the development as well as in the deployment of courses. Budget additional time for testing. Yep. Testing is another kind of unique aspect of it, because we are basically building a piece of software. And even though folks oftentimes don't think of it that way, but as a learning product, really what we are producing is a brand new piece of software every time we do a course, and it has to go through a lot of the same kind of testing that that Microsoft is supposed to do with Microsoft Windows or any of its software. And we experience the challenges. Microsoft doesn't do a proper job of testing Microsoft Windows and other applications, and all the bugs and so forth that we have to deal with. It's just as frustrating for a learner when they go through one of our courses and they're not properly tested, except that, with Microsoft Windows, we sometimes don't have much of a choice but to grin and bear it. With an e-learning course, the client, a learner doesn't has trouble executing a particular page, they're just going to skip it, or they're going to skip the course altogether. All right, good. Thank you. Okay, so let me start diving into this. I want to get into the managed stakeholders piece here. So, these are some tips and best practices that I try to focus on when I'm teaching instructional designers on how to manage projects, especially e-learning projects. The focus for me is on educating, consulting, negotiating, and updating. Providing updates, that's a pretty common thing associated with project managers. We'll talk about that a little bit. Negotiating is often not something that we associate with projects. Not something that's typically emphasized. PMBOK, Project Management Book of Knowledge, doesn't really address negotiation for project managers really being an important skill set. But it really is, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is and what kinds of things you can do about that. Also, project managers often don't see themselves as consultants. The best consultants aren't necessarily very good project managers, but what I found is the best project managers are typically very good consultants. They are very good at analyzing a situation and making recommendations to a client or how to navigate through the development process. And then, of course, managing that relationship in a way that they've built up credibility with their internal clients, their internal stakeholders, and are able to, with some confidence, be able to make a recommendation as to how we navigate this, how we structure the process, how we navigate through the process. All right, was I breaking up? I'll assume I was.
No, but I put us into lecture mode because there were some comments in the chat that there was some reverb going on.
Oh, all right, great. So anyway, so assess roles and needs of stakeholders, kind of an obvious one. Educating stakeholders about the process, maybe not such an obvious one. Most of the time, our stakeholders don't understand what it is that we do. Most of the time, they don't understand what it is that we do with instructional design in general. But when you add in the technology component to it, you add the idea that we're building software here, it gets really complicated really quickly. And when you wrap up that much technology and that much new stuff going on, it's not surprising that sometimes stakeholders are overwhelmed by it. Reviewers are overwhelmed by the things that they're having to review. Subject matter experts are overwhelmed by the things they're having to provide input on. And then, of course, just higher level stakeholders in the organization who aren't as intimately involved in the project, they're especially overwhelmed. And they can't understand why is it taking so long to produce this thing, and why are so many people getting sucked into it, and why do we need to be talking to this group and to that group, and why does it cost so much, and all these kind of questions. So we need to anticipate those kind of questions and educate as much as high up into the organization as we can, all the different stakeholders that are going to be involved, identify what the right level of education is that's needed for each of them, and work that into our conversations with them, work it into presentations, making sure that we clearly articulate what is this process that we're going through, and why is it that we have to go through this in this way, and what are the benefits, and what are the drawbacks, and what are the risks that we run if we deviate from this process and we start going down this path or that path. And it goes back to consulting, that we need to make sure that we lay out a clear roadmap for people and advise them on why that roadmap makes sense and why doing this is better than doing that. And that's something that not all project managers do very well. In fact, I think most of the time project managers tend to assume that their stakeholders understand the process and that they have signed off on the process, when in fact the stakeholder just bought a product, a course, whatever that happens to be, And that's as much as they've signed off on. They haven't really thought about all the things that are involved in producing that thing in that course. They just know that they bought a course and they expect it to be delivered at a certain date, and they expect to have a certain kind of impact by having made that decision. And oftentimes they're caught off guard by all the things that go on in a typical e-learning project. So educating is key, helping them understand expectations. So as you're educating them about the process, what are the things that they can expect from the other stakeholders and from the development team, and what are things that the development team expects from them, right? And oftentimes I'm asked, I want to talk to a subject matter, engage a subject matter expert. What do we tell them? What is it we're expecting from them? And I try to provide very clear guidelines as to what we're expecting from them. It's like, okay, we're going to need their involvement from this week for the next 3 weeks, twice a week meetings of an hour and a half each, and I'm going to need them to be reviewing things offline for another 2 hours or 3 hours for a total commitment, add it all up, maybe 8 hours a week over the next 4 weeks, And that very kind of clearly articulates things. And then I would also articulate things like, and I'll need them to be responsive and get back to us by email within 24 hours of receiving an email or a phone call. We'll need to start scheduling meetings in advance so that we make sure that we get on their calendars. And all that kind of stuff. That's an area where we need to provide a lot of structure, a lot of guidance, because most people have not gone through this before, and they don't understand what it is that we need from them. And then, of course, we need to explain why we need it from them. Why do we need to meet with a subject matter expert so many times for such long periods of time? So we need to show them, here's what we're going to start with, and here's what I'm going to be asking you, the types of questions I'm going to be asking of you, and here's how the content's going to evolve. And eventually, here's how it's going to go into a course, and here's what that's going to look like in a finished course. So we need to show them samples along the way, give them a sense that, we know what we're doing. There is a method to our madness, and let's do everything we can to help them trust us. And that is absolutely critical, is to be able to develop that trust. And you do that through education, through consulting, managing the emotional needs. And this is a very, very important one. So it ties back to what I was just saying about managing the stakeholders and building trust with them, helping reduce some of the anxiety for them about going through this process, anticipating some of the anxiety they will feel down the road about the process. But also, in terms of dealing with our internal development team, whoever they may be, and maybe you're working with a vendor, and you might think, well, it's not my responsibility. I hire the vendor, and they're going to do what I tell them to do, and that's true. But there's still at an emotional level, the development team's going to have a lot invested in this process, because as they go through it, they're bearing the brunt of it. And anything that we can do to make sure that they have positive feelings about this particular project is going to just mean that they're going to work that much harder for you, and for your clients, and for your stakeholders, and they're going to be more flexible. Right? And so one of the things that I always recommend to project managers, both my project managers and also our clients' project managers, is to be flexible and to stand up for the rights of all of the different stakeholders involved in the process, including the project teams, and to not abuse the project team. So there's a tendency sometimes to say, well, all right, the deadline, the timeline shifted because our stakeholders weren't able to get us what we needed in time. And so the natural inclination would be to say, okay, well, the development team will just absorb that delay, which means that they'll have to work nights and weekends and work 14-hour days for 2 weeks on end in order to make this happen. They may do it, but at the end of that, they're going to be burned out. And you may not get the kind of high-quality product that you were hoping for. And so they're going to wind up cutting corners. They're going to wind up doing things that they shouldn't do because they haven't been set up for success. But if we can structure the process and we can work together to try to come up with a compromise solution, we can usually come up with something that will enable the project team to work hard but not kill themselves, and to give them the kind of time that they need in order to do good work. And project teams usually respond to that very well. What they don't respond to very well is, the repeated abuses. And so any of you who've worked on a project team of any sort probably can appreciate that. But I think in a development team where you have these different disciplines, you may have a young, 22-year-old graphic designer and who's very good with all the technology and what have you. You may have a, 25-year-old Flash programmer and working with an instructional designer and a project manager. These are very different personalities, different ways of approaching work, different generations, it's difficult enough to manage all those personalities without introducing more and more stress all the time into the room.
Real quickly, there was, to tie right in with this, there was a question in the chat, a comment that said clients say that they're going to do all of this and then they don't. What then? And I think that kind of fits in with what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So, the project manager, which we're going to get into more detail in a moment, but the project manager needs to act as a consultant, needs to defend the rights and I say the rights. Well, sure, why not? Let's call it rights. It needs to defend the rights and then emotional needs of all the different stakeholders involved, right? And so that means going back to the project team sometimes and having to represent the client's perspective or some other stakeholder's perspective. Maybe it's the learner's perspective, or maybe it's legal and compliance's perspective or IT's perspective, and say, hey, here's what they need, right? Here's what they need from us, and here are the challenges that they're running into, and here's how we can help them out. Can we help them out in this way, and so forth, and help them get to where they need to get to, while still, not driving ourselves too crazy here? Can we find some sort of a compromise solution? Conversely, sometimes they're going to have to go to the client, and they're going to have to defend the rights of their team, right, their development team, and say, hey, look, I understand that you're running late, and I understand that you weren't able to get what you needed from your stakeholders, and I understand this and that, but I also understand that we can't work our development team to death. If we do that, here are the problems that we're going to run into in terms of the quality, in terms of hitting deadlines, in terms of keeping costs and budget. These are the problems that we're going to start running into. And that's what a good consultant does, right? A good consultant doesn't say, no, you can't have this. A good consultant says, you could have it. Here's what it's going to cost you. Right? It's going to cost you in terms of quality because you're going to be working these guys to death. I can bring in more people. It's going to cost you more money. We can add more time. It's going to cause more delays. Right? So these are all things we can do, but there's always a cost to them, whether you realize it or not. And a good consultant helps the client understand what the true costs of any decision are. And so that's one of the ways that you manage. Sometimes, as a PM, you just have to be tough and give your clients tough love. And that's another thing that good consultants are good at, is giving their clients tough love. They've built up enough credibility with their clients that they're able to have those heart-to-heart conversations with them and say, hey, look, come on, help a brother out here. We've done all these things for you, help us out in this case, work with us. And you can have those kind of informal conversations with your internal clients, internal stakeholders, if you've done a good job of building up credibility over time and building up some gratitude points, which I'll talk about in a sec. And of course, number 5, keeping everybody informed throughout the process. We'll talk about project updates and things like that in a moment, but that's a relatively standard thing that PMs do. Sometimes they don't do a good enough job of communicating with all of their stakeholders, because they don't recognize all of their stakeholders. They don't see all their stakeholders every day. And the other thing that PMs often don't do is they don't tailor the messages, they tailor their updates to the different types of audiences that they have as stakeholders, right? So you may have a VP or senior VP who's one of those many stakeholders involved, and that person is a key stakeholder, and they're very high up in the organization. And the level of detail that they need isn't the level of the detail that maybe the other stakeholders need. They need something higher level, more strategic-minded, right? And sometimes our PMs don't do a good job of communicating at that level. Or communicating across departments, right? So there's things that the IT department care about and need that the rest of them don't need. And so how do we make sure that we identify all those different stakeholders and make sure that we are communicating the right way to the different stakeholders and communicating updates and progress in the right way, so that there's meaningful information to each of those stakeholders and actionable. Promote direct, free-flowing communication. That's a critical one. Oftentimes, especially within the team, communications break down when team members stop talking, stop communicating. It's usually not a problem when they over-communicate. Usually project team members will fail to raise risks or escalate risks, will fail to mention when there is any kind of a problem, right? They may wait till the last second to let you know, or they may not let you know at all and you discover it on your own. Or sometimes they don't communicate with each other about things where they're mutually dependent on, like handoffs, for example, where I've just finished something and somebody else needs to pick it up and continue working on it. And if the two people don't communicate with each other, then that thing can just sit around for a day or two and nobody's working on it until somebody realizes, oh, right, that's done. Okay, now I can get going on it. And so you can often lose days, sometimes weeks, because of communication issues. So a good project manager is good at facilitating communication within the team, promoting it, and promoting open dialogue about risk, right? And encouraging their team members to identify risks, even if they don't think that they're likely risks. At least get them out there and talk about them, and let's see what we can do to mitigate them. Most people on a development team are optimistic, and most stakeholders are optimistic. In other words, the development team members, you ask them, how long is it going to take you to, a programmer, let's say, how long is it going to take you to fix this bug? And they say, it should only take me half an hour. Usually they're optimistic. If they say half an hour, it's probably 4 or 5 hours. And so a good project manager needs to recognize that and act accordingly and be either realistic or even pessimistic about those kinds of things. Likewise, stakeholders sometimes are overly optimistic about the things that they can do and the effect that they can have. And so a good project manager, again, is able to wrangle some of that stuff in and challenge some of the things that are overly optimistic, the rose-colored glasses syndrome of managers kind of seeing what they want to see and believing what they want to believe. And again, that goes back to the consulting. Making friends earn points. Let me come back to that in a moment. Don't commit to something without consulting your team member, because with e-learning, there's so much that you don't know as a project manager in terms of your level of expertise. You'll probably never be as expert in the development tools as your developer. You'll never be as artistic as your graphic designer, and you'll never be as familiar with the content as your instructional designer. Before you commit to anything with a client, you always want to check back with your team members. That helps, again, build credibility with your team members. Then they know that you're not over committing them to things that they haven't had input on. And it reflects, make sure that you're not in a situation where you have to go back to a client and tell them, no, I said we could do this, and now I'm saying we can't do it because we went back and checked, because that only erodes your credibility. Then negotiate, we'll come back to that, and act as a process consultant. That's really what the whole thing's about. Negotiating with clients. There's some things that you're going to be able to give up, or that you may have to give up in your negotiations with stakeholders. Oftentimes they're going to mean the team's going to have to do more work. They're going to have to incur some sort of a delay, which might disrupt the team in some aspect. They might have to absorb the delay, which means they'll have to work faster or work harder in order to make up the time difference. You may have to allow additional review cycles, which means additional changes, which then, of course, leads to additional work and absorbing delays. You may have to expand the number of reviewers, or as somebody mentioned earlier, they may introduce new stakeholders throughout the process, which again will inevitably lead to more work. Or you just may have to allow some out-of-scope changes to be made during the reviews. Things that we thought were locked down and agreed on Now somebody says, no, that's not going to work. We need to change it. Oftentimes you can't. You can try, but oftentimes you won't win those battles. When something's got to change, it's got to change. So the best that you can do is try to negotiate to get something in return for it. And so the things that you can get in return is, at a minimum, get gratitude. Make sure that your stakeholders understand that you're giving something up, something important up. Maybe it's that you're doing more work. And make sure that they understand this decision that you're making means that we're going to have to do more work. How much more work? An additional 20 hours, an additional 30 hours, whatever. Be as transparent about that as possible. If you're going to have to incur a delay, absorb a delay, and as a result, people are going to have to work nights and weekends, tell people that. Make sure your clients, your internal or external clients, recognize that you're doing something for them, and that they in turn should be grateful to you and to the team for that. That gratitude is something that you can later cash in for other concessions that you might want. That's one of the ways in which you build up credibility. You build up points that down the road you're able to cash in for something that is really important to you and the team. The other things that you can try to get in your negotiations is more time, additional funding, and other types of concessions that will enable you to get the job done for them. So what the key thing to remember here is, even if you can't get anything tangible in terms of more time or more money, at least get the gratitude. Make sure. Too often PMs will go back to their teams, they'll figure out a way to make things work, and the client will never know just how hard it was for the development team to do what it is that they asked. And so they'll think that it was easy by default. And if they think that it's easy, then tomorrow they're going to come back with more stuff like that. And they're always going to just assume that it's easy. Well, they did it for me the last time. I'm sure they can do it for me again. And certainly there are some things that are easy. And if they're easy, great, let the client know they're easy. But the things that are difficult, let them know that they're difficult. So that next time around, then they keep asking, you've built up sort of those credits where you can at some point say, hey, look, enough's enough. We've given in on these previous 5 occasions, and we haven't asked you for more funding. This time I need to ask for more funding because we just can't get this done without that. And if there's been this track record where they've had visibility into just how much you've absorbed for them, it's much easier to have that difficult conversation when the time comes. But a lot of times our PMs surprise our clients where they say, I'm sorry, we just are, at this point we're going to have to get more funding. And the client will say, well, what's the big deal? This isn't any different than what I asked you to do last week. And they say, well, yeah, but that was a big deal. Well, you never told me it was a big deal. And so we wind up having a lot of those kind of conversations where the clients, whoever's holding the purse string, doesn't understand just how disruptive things have been on there, and how their delays and their actions have caused problems for the development team. So again, it's not just promoting good communication within the development team, but it's that back and forth communication between the development team and the stakeholders, and using that communication in a strategic way to help you get what you need from both parties. So, let me show you this real quick. So this is just a process flow diagram that I use sometimes. It's kind of a variation of one that I use with clients. It just gives them a sense of all the different moving parts that are going on within a typical development process. They tend to respond well to visuals. One of the things I try to avoid doing as a project manager is put a Microsoft project plan and a work breakdown structure in front of a client. Let's see if I have one here. Come back to this. Yeah. So I try never to put something like this in front of a client. Even clients who understand project management, most of the time they can't follow the details of a project plan very well. Even with a visual Gantt chart like this, many of them have trouble with it. Most people really have trouble with visuals with project plans that they've not created themselves. If you've created it, you understand it. And somebody else creates one for you, very hard to follow. So instead, try to develop some sort of visuals, maybe like that cartoon that we looked at the beginning, of the presentation, or something like this, or a spreadsheet, or something that makes sense to your audience. And you can use that kind of thing to educate them. And then the other thing is project updates. Again, this is something that you'd want to tailor to different audiences. For certain people in the organization, you might do, once a month, getting together with them, having a chat with them, maybe getting them over lunch and doing an informal update. For other people in the organization, you might need some sort of a formal written document. And so we have a project update reports that we use to structure weekly updates to a project. And that might include, in addition to a summary of what's been going on, what has been accomplished, what is going to be accomplished, over the next week or two, milestones that we're going to hit or not hit, risks that we're in the process, that we've identified and are in the process of managing, mitigating in some way, and then of course action items. Who's got action items that are outstanding, that need to be taken care of. So all that kind of information is part of what you might include in a project update report or in your verbal project update. So let me stop here before we go on to talk about the managing the process, and let me get your thoughts on managing stakeholders. Are there any other, those of you who have done a fair amount of project management, are there any other things that you feel I'm missing here that we should be including?
Scott has a good comment in the chat that I'd like to share, and maybe you can comment on. Yes, says, I'm curious how many of you have dedicated full-time project managers. Due to resource constraints, my organization is considering having the lead ID also manage the project. That concerns me that one person cannot handle both workloads. You want to jump in on that one, Gus?
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually very relevant to things that we're going through at PDG as well. I firmly believe that, at least with e-learning, that it's important for a project team member, for a project manager, to have a good sense of what it is what work is actually taking place in the development team. So I don't care if they come from a graphic design background, a development background, or an instructional design background. I want to know that my PM knows how that work gets done and knows it intimately. So I think it's very good for project managers to come from the ranks of the project team members. And I think it's fine for an instructional designer to be the project lead, especially for smaller projects, maybe even some medium-sized projects. When you get to some larger projects, I still think it's a good idea for an instructional designer, as an example, to be the project manager, but I think you have to recognize that you may need more than just that one person to do everything. You may need a project manager who is an instructional designer, has that background. But in addition, you may need one or more additional instructional designers to help do a lot of the other work. Or you just might have to reduce the number of projects that a person is working on at any given time. So in a typical organization, people who are instructional designers are working on multiple projects. And so maybe they're working on 3, 4, 5 different projects. Maybe some of you have got 10, 15 projects going on at any given time. If you're acting as the project manager and the person doing all the design work, and you're the only one doing it, you're probably going to need more time, and therefore you probably can handle fewer projects. And so if you were handling 10 before, maybe now you can only handle 4 at a time. If you were handling 4 before, maybe you can only handle 1 or 2 at a time. And of course, it depends on the size and nature of those projects, but something's got to give. And so if you're going to take a PM out of the mix and have the lead ID act as the PM, well, something's got to give, because there's no more time in a day, and there's only so many nights and weekends that person's going to be able to work. So something's got to give. All right, so let me, I know we're going to run out of time here. Fortunately, Gus is a little long-winded, so sorry about that. But I'll pick up on some of these other things offline with you. But I want to talk a little bit about managing the process, because this is also very important for the PM, whoever it is. And here in particular, there's a lot of things about the process that a PM is going to be involved in. But the things I try to draw the PM's attention to are the choke points in the process. The choke points are the high-risk points in a process. In any given project plan, I can usually go scan through it and be able to identify these are places where you really need to focus your attention on. These are your choke points. And usually there are places where there are a lot of dependencies and you're relying on something important happening before all these other things can happen. And so that is a very clear choke point, and you can usually identify those in a project plan by the predecessors or the dependencies that are assigned to it. So that's important, and so I try to work with PMs to try to, wherever possible, break out those dependencies and enable workflows to happen in parallel with one another, rather than all funneling into one choke point. And so there's some ways to make that happen. The other places, though, that are just as important as those dependencies and are not always as easy to spot are points of collaboration. Right? So at what point does a project team need to get together, for example, with each other to brainstorm, to define a strategy, to figure out what things are going to look like, what have you? I try to encourage PMs to identify those points and actually put them in their project plans, and actually put those meetings in their project plans with a clear definition of what the meeting is for. This meeting here is to brainstorm what the look and feel of the course should look like. This meeting here is to review mock-ups of what that look and feel are going to be. Too many PMs, and this I think also comes from PMBOK and just from the culture, the PM culture, too many PMs, I think, rely on having weekly team meetings where everybody gets together and does updates with each other, and they all pat each other on the back, and then they move on. And they treat that as a substitute for really planning out the meetings that are needed. And so I actually have, in some cases, banned weekly meetings. And what I tell the PMs to do instead is talk to your team members about the process, figure out where in the process the team members need to meet and for what purpose, and then identify those in the project plan, have people schedule those in advance, and get them on people's calendar instead of just trying to do updates all the time. You know, if you still need to do updates, fine, do updates. But what I really want to make sure that you focus on is what are the points that the team needs to collaborate with each other, when do they need to collaborate with me, a technical lead, or whoever it is. Let's identify those points. Handoffs are another one. It's another high-risk area in a project plan where, say, a graphic designer produces a look and feel and needs to cut out those graphics into individual pieces and hand those off to the developer who's going to put those into the course. That's a high-risk situation because there's a handoff involved there, and a lot of funny, funky things can happen during those handoffs, and miscommunications can happen, miscues, files not being right, version control problems, all sorts of stuff. So that's where a PM needs to really focus their attention on, make sure that there's a clean handoff from one person to the other. And it goes back to providing good communication, providing structure, and so forth. Reviews are another one. Anytime that there's going to be an internal review within the team, an external review with clients or stakeholders, those are high-risk situations that need to be managed. And inevitably, if reviews aren't handled properly, you're going to have delays, you're going to have scope problems. If people don't know what it is that they're supposed to be reviewing for, they might either miss things that they're supposed to be catching, or they will catch things that they weren't supposed to be looking for in the first place, both of which can be a big waste of time. And then there's being proactive just in general about risk management, risk identification, risk escalation, risk mitigation. And those are places that's more of an ongoing task for the PM and for the team. It's figuring out how do we make sure we are constantly identifying risks and escalating them, discussing them, figuring out how we're going to mitigate them. And so wherever possible, I try to build in buffers into a project plan that allow the team a little bit of flexibility in dealing and managing those risks, right? And so on a typical project plan, they may hit a point in the project where it actually says on the project plan, here are 5 days of cushion time that we've built in. So that as the team starts to identify risks and problems, maybe somebody's going to be on a vacation for a day, what have you, they can start drawing from that buffer. Drawing down, it's almost like an account, like credit that you're giving them, and they can draw down on that until they've used up those 5 days. And then at that point, any additional delays we're going to have to bump the schedule out. So, and I try to work with clients on that and be transparent with them about it and explain to them why that's important. I don't want every time that we have a conversation and there's a little bit of a scope creep, I don't want to have to keep coming back to you and telling you that we have to update the project plan. I just assume build some of that extra time in and then be able to draw down on that with those little things. Once we hit a certain point and we've eliminated our margin of error, we're going to have to start adding days to the project plan. And most of them will understand that if you can explain it that way.
Hey, Gus, we need to wind it up, hon.
All right. So, in conclusion, I'd like to say, but thank you. These are just examples here of parallel workflows, specifically in the project plan, identifying where you have meetings, and then building cushion. And you see cushion time in there in that project plan. It might be a little hard to see, but those are just examples. The other thing I want to point out here is you don't have to show them that Microsoft project plan, right? In this case, Invisio created a calendar, which is a more visual representation of the process. Anyway, managing for quality, we can talk about it another time. It's obviously very important, but I think if you do a good job of managing your stakeholders and managing your process, high quality kind of flows naturally from that.
We'll stick around for a while and handle questions.
Yeah.
If that's all right with you. If you can stick around for 10 minutes or so, Gus, we'll see if anybody has questions.
Absolutely.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming. We try to stay as much as we possibly can here on time. I'd like to, as we leave here, make the announcement for April. We're going to have Jackie Beck talking about reusable learning objects. Jackie is with Brookwood Media Arts and does some training for Adobe. She and I wrote an article a little while ago on reusable learning objects, and I think she's going to show you some really nice ways to use reusable learning objects. So that's April the 13th. If you haven't signed up, go out to the website, and, we'll be sending out the emails. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Gus specifically for the wonderful presentation. You can always tell when somebody knows what they're talking about, Gus, and you certainly can tell that you're living the project management experience because your examples were absolutely right on and wonderful. We'll be around, Gus and I will be around for a little bit. We will be putting the archive and the PDF of Gus's slides up on the website, so you can access them up there and, an email. My girl Alice will be getting an email out to everybody when that happens. Great job, Gus. Thanks, and thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you hopefully in April. And then in May, we have a panel of corporate training managers. We've got Hugh Landers from Miller Coors. We've got Marita coming from ING, and then we've got our own Robin Eisenberg from Preview Cable. So we will look forward to that. Thanks, folks. Thanks for coming. Enjoy this wonderful, gorgeous day, and we'll see you all in April. The website is lasalle.edu/ITM. You'll see a thing up there for the lunchtime learning, Gina, and all of our stuff is delivered up there. So just go to lasalle.edu/ITM. All right, thanks. Now, if anybody has any additional questions for Gus, we'll be around for a couple minutes. Feel free to chat away here.
Yeah, fire away.
Yeah, it was a great session, Gus. I thought it was absolutely right on.
What's that?
I really enjoyed your session. Right on. Good example.
Oh, thank you.
Very realistic, very in the trenches kind of real, and that's good. Too often project management, I think, is presented theoretically.
Yeah, there's some blood and guts there.
Yeah, having done I don't know how many project management courses for some of our finer government agencies, and you have to be real. I also I love the advice, tough love, and also respect your team, because too often that's
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, I feel like it's a whole semester-long course. But
yeah, Ken, that's all.
so maybe we'll put one together at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe we can do this again in the fall. Maybe we can do this like a sequence kind of thing, because it is a lot to cover.
Yeah.
And
So actually, a couple questions came through. One from Denise here. What do you do when development problems cause delivery delays through no fault of the client? Yeah, and that happens. And there's unfortunately not any good ways. There are a lot of bad ways to handle it. One bad way would be to deny it, to blame the client for stuff they didn't actually do. To say that things, that kind of stuff, right? So just really being open and honest with them. Say, hey, look, we ran into these kind of problems. We thought this part of it was going to be easy, and we ran into some problems. And then the important thing really is to show the client that you're now on top of it, right? You realize that this is a crisis. You realize that that your team has messed up, and so we need to. And we've had this kind of problem in the past where that's happened, and we've gone to our management team and said, okay, look, we need to show the client that we understand that we messed up and that we're going to do everything in our power to fix this. And so we're going to put more resources on it. We're going to provide maybe more detailed structure and, have a day-by-day breakdown of all the things that are happening, so we have more visibility into what's happening. And so we're going to kind of pull in these extra, as we're going to create a war room, right, where we bring everybody together and feed them and entertain them and whatever. But we're going to, we're taking some steps to make sure that we get this deed done as quickly as possible, and we make up for the things that we messed up. And then the other thing would be, if you can give some things that maybe the client had asked for that maybe you had pushed back on in the past. Like, for example, recently we had a client where they said what we were supposed to deliver, say, on a Monday, we wound up delivering it on a Wednesday, and the client was okay with it. But we said, you know what, for giving us those extra 2 days, we're going to put extra people on this, and for giving us those extra 2 days, we're going to give you this thing that you had asked for that we didn't think we could get to, but we're going to put extra resources on it so we make sure we deliver it with that additional thing that you'd asked for, as sort of a way of saying thank you for giving us this extra time. And so to me, it's a lot like, you're and I come from the restaurant business, so for me, it's a lot like, managing a complaint that somebody has about their food. You're not just going to go and heat it up for them and give it to them. You're going to try to make sure that they get what they asked for and then get a little bit more, so that they walk away feeling, at least neutral about it, if not feeling like they maybe got a little bit extra out of the deal, and have them walk away feeling good about it, and feeling like that you really appreciate that you screwed up and you're not going to let this happen again, and that you feel their pain. So those are some things that we try to do when our development team messes up. That thankfully that's rare, but it does happen. Did that answer your question, Denise? Yeah. So,
can you hear me? The answer is yes. That was a great answer.
Oh, thanks, Denise.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay.
Okay, good. And then there was another question. Can you talk about risk? How to assess when you do not understand all the details of the business? Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Whoever DE is?
see. You can talk now. He says from a PM perspective, Gus.
Right. Don't understand this. So this is a PM who's working as a consultant for a company, and they don't understand the details of how that company works, how that business works. Yeah. Okay. So, obviously, the answer is you gotta learn the details of how the business works. That would be number one. But the risks usually are associated more with the process than with the business. So, you can usually identify the risk by looking for some of those things that we talked about, like the choke points, right, in the process. Looking at dependencies and handoffs, and any time when something is being transferred from one person to another, whether it's knowledge or resources or materials, or something's being given to them to review, any of those kind of places, the white spaces in the project plan, if you will, those are places where there's always potential for risk, and significant potential for risk. And so that's the thing that the PM can really focus on, is making sure that those areas are locked down. It's harder for them to identify, am I in a type of organization where the culture is such that they don't read any emails, right? That, unfortunately, you'll find out the hard way as you send out emails. Or they're the type of people who prefer to do reviews face-to-face rather than virtually or in writing. There's some of those things you can ask about, but again, they're going to be things that are tied into those white spaces in the project plan, things that are more related to the reviews, the testing, the handoffs, the dependencies. If you start from there, what you'll usually start doing is start asking a lot of good questions about how does an organization handle these types of things, right? So, and so your point of contact, whoever that is within your organization or your stakeholders, you can go to them with those kind of questions, and ask them, how would you like to review this stuff, and how much level of detail would you like to have? Would you prefer that we kind of walked you through this piece by piece, or do you want to just look at this on your own, or do you want to look at it on your own and then have us walk us through it, right? So figuring out what it is your different stakeholders need and want, and how they work best, that's part of that, acting as a consultant and asking good questions and exploring those kind of things with them. The important thing is, as a PM, that you really know your process really well, and that you know where things can break down in your process. That will lead you to asking the right questions about the organization.
Does anybody else have any questions for Gus? Well, we're fortunate enough to have him here. How do you get up to speed on the development team's needs?
Yeah. So for me, it was, I was an instructional designer, and I came into it that way. And I spent some time working at Allen Communication, and there I got to work with lots of project teams. And for me, a really important part of that learning experience was sitting down next to a developer as they were working on a course, and seeing how they were responding to my storyboards, right? And the questions that they would ask me, and the challenges that they would have, and seeing what, where the trouble spots were. Same with the graphic designers, right? So we're, brainstorming around look and feel, and then to be able to get back there and be able to look over their shoulder and sit with them and have them talk me through what it is that they're doing. Sometimes they would find that annoying, but for the most part, they appreciated it. Somebody actually took the time and interest to want to understand what it is that they did. And I would ask them questions, because it's the person in me who wants to know, what are some problems that you typically run into when you're working with an instructional designer? And they'll be very vocal about telling you that. It's like, well, these IDs, they don't know how to do this, and they don't know how to do that. They don't understand how long it takes to do this. They don't get that you can't just, be super duper creative in a 1 hour, 1 hour span of time, and then suddenly pull really creative look and feels out of your briefcase. And so they'll start hitting you with that stuff, and then they'll tell you, it's like, well, they'll give me this kind of direction, they'll be really ambiguous, and then I come back to them with something, they tell me, no, that's not it, and we'll keep going back and forth 100 times, and so then of course I ask, well, so what would be a better way to do it? It's like, well, a better way would be either if they can be really clear about what they want, or if they can mock up what they want, or they can whiteboard it or something to show me what it is that's in their head, and then I don't have such a steep learning curve to figure out what it is that they really want, and then to be able to actually sit with me after I've come up with something rough, then they can look at it and give me some feedback before I invest too much time and effort into it. Oh, all right, cool. So then I begin to adopt those kind of practices into what I do. So it's a lot like everything else, right? It's about kind of rolling up your sleeves and getting in there and working with folks and asking about process-related issues. So that's how I did it. The other thing, of course, was getting in their shoes a little bit, and I learned Photoshop on my own and went out and created some stuff and created some graphics for sometimes for courses I was working on, and sometimes for just things on the side for my own personal website. And I start getting a sense for what a graphic designer has to do, and then building my website in Dreamweaver. I had to go learn Dreamweaver and build it and learn some of the things that the developers do, and then, of course, figure out how to transfer graphics into the website and so forth. And so I started to get a feel firsthand for what it takes to do that kind of stuff, and that helped me communicate better with the development team, helped me understand what it is that they go through a little bit better. Ultimately, that led to eventually building some courses of my own, all by myself or in collaboration with others. So cross-training myself, really, on how the team, on all the different roles within the team, that was very helpful. But not that you won't always have the luxury of being able to do that. So that's where if you can sit down with them, shadow them, talk to them, ask them questions about how they like to work, what's most effective for them. Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't know. Sometimes you have to learn that through observation. You're quite welcome. All right, does anybody else have any other questions?
Anybody else have any questions for Gus here?
Pleasure. Thanks, Denise. Talk to you soon.
Okay, Gus, I'd just like to thank you again. Thank you
Thanks,
for joining us. And I gave you a couple things in the private chat there. We'll catch up.
Yeah.
And if that's it, folks, we're going to call our March 9th Lunch and Learn and to an end here, and we look forward to seeing everybody again.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
You. We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.